There is a quiet limitation in the human body that rarely draws attention, even though it has been present for as long as humans have walked across the earth, a simple and persistent detail that does not stop movement but shapes it in subtle ways, that the feet, which carry the entire weight of the body, are also one of the easiest places for heat to leave, and unlike many animals, early humans did not have thick fur or natural insulation to protect them from cold ground, meaning that every step, especially in colder environments, involved a slow and constant loss of warmth, not dramatic, not immediate, but steady enough to matter over time. And this creates a quiet contradiction, because the human body is built for endurance, for long-distance travel, for adaptation across different landscapes, and yet it carries this small but important weakness at the point where it meets the ground. And if this limitation has been present from the beginning, then it raises a simple question that does not have an easy answer. Why early humans couldn't keep their feet warm? There is a moment so simple that it almost disappears from attention. A moment that has happened countless times across the long history of human movement, when the bare foot meets the ground, and at first nothing seems unusual. No sudden pain, no sharp signal, only a quiet contact between skin and surface. But within that contact, something begins to change, something that cannot be seen directly, as heat starts to move away from the body into the earth below, not in a dramatic release, but in a slow and continuous flow, because the human body is almost always warmer than the ground it stands on, and wherever there is a difference, there is movement, and in this case, that movement is the gradual loss of warmth through the soles of the feet, and this process does not require extreme cold to begin. It happens on cool soil, on damp grass, on stone that has held the memory of night, and even on surfaces that do not feel cold at first touch. The transfer still continues, steady and quiet, shaping the experience of standing, walking, and waiting in ways that are easy to overlook, yet difficult to escape over time. And if we imagine this not as a single moment, but as something repeated across hours, across days, across generations, then the scale of this small exchange begins to grow, because early humans did not step onto insulated surfaces or manufactured barriers. They stepped directly onto the same ground that absorbed heat without resistance, and this ground was not uniform, sometimes dry and loose, sometimes dense and compact, sometimes wet enough to pull warmth away more quickly, and each variation changed the rate at which heat left the body, but never removed the process entirely. And so the foot, which supports the full weight of the body and allows movement across distance, also becomes a point of quiet vulnerability, not because it fails, but because it cannot fully prevent this ongoing loss. And over time, this creates a subtle tension between movement and exposure, because to move is to remain in contact with the ground, and to remain in contact is to continue losing heat. And this tension does not stop early humans from walking, from traveling, from surviving, but it adds a constant condition to every step, a background process that is always present, even when it is not consciously felt. And when movement slows, when a person stands still or rests, the effect becomes more noticeable, as the body produces less heat through activity, while the ground continues to draw warmth away at its own pace. And in these quieter moments, the contrast becomes clearer, because the foot does not have a thick layer of insulation, it does not have fur to trap heat, it does not have a design that prioritizes warmth over flexibility. Instead, it is structured for balance, for grip, for the ability to adapt to uneven surfaces, and these features are valuable, but they come with a cost that is not paid all at once but slowly, through repeated contact with the world beneath. And if we trace this back to the earliest conditions where the human body took its current form, we begin to see that this was never a temporary problem waiting to be solved, but a condition that existed alongside human movement from the beginning, because the environments early humans moved through were often open, exposed, and variable, with surfaces that changed from warm to cool to cold within short distances, and without consistent barriers between the body and the ground, the exchange of heat remained constant, shaping how long one could remain still, how quickly discomfort might appear, and how the body responded over time, not through sudden failure, but through gradual adjustment. And this raises a quiet point that does not resolve itself easily, because if the act of simply standing or walking carried with it this continuous loss of warmth, then the question is not why it happened in certain conditions, but why it never fully stopped, even as humans continued to adapt to the world around them, and why this simple contact between foot and ground remained, in such a consistent way, a place where warmth could always slip away. When this quiet loss of warmth continues beyond a single step and begins to stretch across time, it becomes something more than a momentary sensation. It becomes a condition that shapes how the body behaves without requiring conscious attention, because early humans did not move in short bursts across protected surfaces. They moved across open ground for long periods, often with no separation between skin and earth, and in that continuity, the exchange of heat never pauses. It simply adjusts in speed depending on the surface, the moisture, and the surrounding air, and this creates a pattern that is subtle but persistent, where the feet are always slightly behind the rest of the body in terms of warmth, never fully catching up, never fully stabilizing. And this matters not because it stops movement, but because it influences how long movement can remain comfortable, how often it must be interrupted, and how the body distributes its energy over time. And if we consider the environments where early humans are understood to have lived, from open plains to wooded areas, from dry ground to damp soil, the variability itself becomes part of the problem, because there is no single condition that the body can adapt to in a fixed way. Instead, there is constant change, and with each change, the rate of heat loss shifts slightly, sometimes slower, sometimes faster, but always present, always ongoing, and this makes the feet a kind of interface between the body and the environment, not just in terms of movement, but in terms of temperature exchange. And unlike other parts of the body that can be more easily covered or protected even with simple materials, the feet remain exposed in a way that is difficult to fully control, especially when mobility is required. And this creates a balance that must be maintained, because covering the feet too heavily could interfere with grip, with awareness of the ground, with the ability to respond quickly to uneven surfaces, while leaving them uncovered maintains function but allows heat to continue leaving. And in this balance, there is no complete solution, only a series of small adjustments that never fully remove the underlying condition. And over extended periods, this condition begins to influence behavior in indirect ways, not through conscious decisions, but through patterns that emerge from repeated experience, such as a tendency to keep moving rather than remain still for too long, or to seek surfaces that feel less cold even if they are not significantly warmer, or to shift weight from one foot to another as a way of redistributing contact with the ground. And these responses do not eliminate heat loss, but they show how the body and behavior work together to manage it. And if we step back and consider this not as a series of isolated actions, but as a continuous relationship between the human body and the surfaces it moves across, we begin to see that the issue is not simply one of exposure, but one of constant negotiation, where the body is always adjusting to a condition that cannot be fully controlled. And this negotiation becomes more visible when movement slows or stops, because without the internal heat generated by walking, the difference between the body and the ground becomes more pronounced. And the feet, being the point of contact, reflect that difference more quickly than other parts of the body, and this leads to a gradual change in sensation, from neutral to cool, from cool to uncomfortable. Not suddenly, but in a way that builds over time. And if this pattern repeats day after day, across different environments and conditions, it forms a kind of background experience that is always present, even if it is not always noticed. And this raises a deeper question about the nature of adaptation itself, because if early humans lived within this continuous exchange of heat, and if their survival depended on movement across these surfaces, then why did the body not develop a more complete form of insulation at the point where this loss was most consistent? And what does that suggest about the limits of what the human body can change and what it must simply manage over time? As this quiet exchange between foot and ground continues across longer stretches of time, it begins to shape not only movement, but also the way rest itself is experienced, because there are moments when movement slows, when the body pauses, when weight settles instead of shifting, and in those moments the balance between heat production and heat loss changes, as the warmth generated by motion fades while the ground continues to draw heat away at a steady pace. And this creates a gradual transition that is easy to overlook at first, a slow cooling that does not announce itself sharply, but builds through stillness, through contact that is no longer interrupted by steps, And in early human environments, where rest often happened directly on the earth or very close to it, this condition extended beyond the act of standing into the act of stopping, into the time when the body might need to recover, to remain still, to conserve energy. And yet, even in those moments, the feet remained connected to surfaces that did not return warmth, only received it. And this creates a quiet tension between the need to rest and the ongoing loss that rest allows to become more visible, because while the body seeks stillness, the environment continues its own process, unchanged by intention, unchanged by need, and this tension does not lead to immediate failure, but it introduces a limit, a point where stillness becomes less sustainable, not because the body cannot remain at rest, but because the conditions surrounding that rest begin to shift the internal balance. And over time, this may shape how long one remains in a single place, how often position changes, how the body subtly responds to discomfort without forming a clear decision. And these responses are not dramatic, they are small, often unconscious, such as drawing the feet closer to the body, placing them on slightly different surfaces, or adjusting posture in ways that reduce direct contact. And while these actions do not eliminate the transfer of heat, they suggest an ongoing effort to manage it, an effort that does not fully succeed but continues nonetheless. And if we consider this within the broader context of early human life, where environments could shift between warmer and cooler conditions within a single day, where shade, moisture, and wind could alter the temperature of the ground itself, then the variability becomes part of the experience, not a rare exception but a constant factor, and the feet, being the first point of contact, reflect these changes more immediately than other parts of the body, responding to differences that may not yet be felt elsewhere, and this makes them both a tool for sensing the environment and a pathway through which the environment acts on the body. And this dual role carries a cost, because sensitivity allows awareness, but it also allows exposure, and without a consistent barrier between skin and surface, the exchange of heat remains direct, unfiltered, and ongoing. And if this condition has been present across the long span of human development, then it suggests that the relationship between the body and the ground has always involved this imbalance, where the ground does not adapt to the body, but the body must continually adjust to the ground. And this raises a final reflection for this beginning point, not as a conclusion but as an opening toward what follows, that the simple act of placing a foot on the earth has never been neutral. It has always carried with it a small and continuous cost, one that does not stop movement but quietly shapes it, and one that remains difficult to fully remove, no matter how long the human body has existed within these conditions. If the feet lose warmth so easily, the next question is not only about the ground beneath them, but about the feet themselves, because the human foot was never shaped mainly to hold heat, and that fact becomes clearer the more closely we look at what it is built to do, as it is a structure made for balance, for flexibility, for carrying body weight across long distances, for adjusting to uneven surfaces, and for giving the body constant information about the world below. But none of those functions require thick natural insulation, and in some ways they are made harder by it, because a foot that must bend, grip, and respond to the texture of the ground cannot simply become a heavy insulated pad without losing part of what makes it useful. And this may be one of the quiet reasons why warmth was never fully protected there, not because heat did not matter, but because other demands were already shaping the form of the foot in a different direction, toward movement rather than storage, toward contact rather than separation. And when compared in broad terms with many mammals that move over cold surfaces, the difference is easy to notice, because humans do not have fur covering the feet. They do not have the same kind of natural outer layer that traps warm air close to the skin, and they do not have a pore structure designed around a different balance between sensitivity and insulation. And this does not mean that human feet are weak or poorly made, only that they belong to a body whose main thermal protections lie elsewhere, more in the control of circulation, posture, activity, shelter, and eventually clothing than in the foot itself. And this leaves the feet in a strange position, essential for survival and yet never fully protected from one of the oldest pressures in the human environment, which is the steady pull of heat into colder surfaces. And the more we think about early humans, the more important this becomes, because once the body had already become mostly hairless compared with other mammals, and once upright walking had become central to daily life, The feet were no longer minor edges of the body, but major working surfaces, repeatedly exposed, repeatedly loaded, repeatedly asked to stay useful in conditions that could cool them little by little. And the skin on the sole can become thicker through use. But thickness is not the same as insulation, because skin that resists abrasion does not automatically trap warmth well. It mainly protects against wear, pressure, and roughness. And that distinction matters, since a tougher foot may survive contact with the ground more effectively while still continuing to lose heat through that same contact. And this helps explain why endurance and exposure can exist together, why early humans could keep moving and yet still carry this constant thermal disadvantage at the body's lowest edge. And there is also the issue of blood flow, because the feet are far from the core, and once a body begins protecting its central organs more carefully in cool conditions, the outer parts can become less warmly supplied, not because they are unimportant, but because the body must prioritize, and in that prioritization the feet can remain functional while becoming less warm, which again shows that survival does not require perfect comfort, only enough function to continue, enough circulation to preserve tissue, enough balance to keep moving, and that threshold is very different from true warmth. And when we imagine early humans near the beginning of this long story, moving across African ground where the human form first emerged, before spreading into more seasonal and colder landscapes, we can see that the foot carried forward a design that worked for locomotion long before it ever faced the most severe thermal demands later populations would encounter, which means the foot did not begin as a specialized cold weather structure and never became one in any complete natural sense. And that point is important because it keeps us from turning this history into a neat tale of perfect adaptation, as the human body did not solve every problem through anatomy alone, and the feet may be one of the clearest examples, a place where the body remained good enough rather than ideal, capable rather than insulated, flexible rather than warm, and this helps answer the question at the center of the story in a more careful way, because early humans could not keep their feet warm not simply because the world was cold, but because the feet they depended on were shaped first for movement, contact, and survival across uneven ground, not for holding heat against it. The more closely the human foot is examined, the more it seems shaped by compromise, not by failure, but by the need to serve several demands at once, and this is one reason warmth was never its most protected quality, because the foot is not simply a platform under the body, it is a living structure filled with bones, joints, tendons, ligaments, skin, and nerves, all arranged in a way that allows it to absorb force, adjust to irregular ground, and return energy during movement. And these tasks require a kind of responsiveness that thick natural insulation would partly interfere with, since a heavily padded or fur-covered surface can reduce the direct feedback that helps a moving body remain balanced and aware of what lies beneath it. And in early human life that awareness mattered, because walking across mixed terrain meant constantly responding to stone, soil, roots, slopes, mud, and changing textures underfoot. And the foot had to do more than endure pressure. It had to communicate with the rest of the body, sending quiet signals about stability, angle, and contact. And those signals depend on exposure, not on complete separation from the outside world, which means that one of the same features that helped the human body move effectively also made it harder to preserve warmth where contact was most constant. And this becomes even clearer when we think about how the human body changed over time, because as upright walking became central, the feet took on a greater burden than they carry in many other mammals, supporting the full weight of the body in a very direct way, while also serving as the final point through which long-distance travel became possible. And that combination placed enormous importance on structure, spring, and endurance. But it did not automatically produce better insulation, because the evolutionary pressures shaping the foot were linked above all to movement and efficiency, not to comfort during prolonged contact with cold surfaces. And in that sense, the human foot reflects a deeper pattern in the body itself, where survival often depends on what is sufficient rather than what is ideal. And sufficient warmth is not the same as lasting warmth, because the body does not need every part to remain equally protected at all times. It only needs enough protection to preserve function and prevent serious damage, and the feet can continue to function even while growing cool, even while losing heat steadily, and that creates the quiet impression that the system is working, when in fact it is only enduring a condition it cannot completely solve, and this helps explain why the sole of the foot, though capable of becoming thicker through repeated use, does not become a true natural barrier against cold, since toughness and insulation are not the same thing, and a sole that tolerates abrasion, pressure, and rough surfaces still allows heat to pass into colder ground below. And once that distinction is understood, the old question becomes less mysterious, because the body was never building a winter covering there. It was building a surface that could survive contact, carry weight, and remain flexible, and these are not identical goals. And there is also the matter of the foot's place within the body's larger thermal system, because the feet lie far from the central organs, and whenever the body faces cooler conditions, the protection of the core becomes more important than equal warmth in every distant part. And that means the feet exist at the edge of the body's priorities, still necessary, still valuable, but more easily surrendered to reduced warmth than the chest, the abdomen, or the head. And this may have mattered even in the earlier African settings where the human body first took shape, because the issue was never only extreme cold, but the constant fact that ground surfaces, especially in shade, at night, after rain, or in the early morning, could remain cooler than living tissue, allowing small but repeated losses of heat over long periods. And as humans later spread into more seasonal and colder regions, they carried with them a foot that was already deeply committed to mobility and contact, not one newly redesigned for insulation. And so the story is not that early humans lacked intelligence or failed to adapt, but that the body they inherited and refined had already made its choices long before it ever reached every environment it would later cross. And among those choices was a foot that could travel far, feel the ground well, and endure a great deal, while still never fully escaping the quiet cost of warmth slipping away through every step. If the foot is shaped by compromise, then its limits become most visible not in moments of strength, but in the quiet thresholds where function continues while comfort slowly fades, and one of those thresholds lies in the way warmth is managed at the edge of the body, because the human system does not distribute heat evenly at all times. It adjusts, it redirects, it holds closer what must be protected and allows more distant parts to fluctuate, and the feet belong to that outer edge, far from the center where heat is produced and more easily maintained. And this distance matters, because warmth must travel through blood, and when conditions encourage the body to conserve heat, that flow can become more selective, favoring the core while reducing what reaches the extremities. And this does not stop the feet from working, but it changes the conditions under which they operate, making them cooler even before the ground begins to draw heat away. And once that contact is added, the process becomes layered, not just a loss into the environment, but a reduction from within, and together these effects create a pattern that is consistent, even if it is rarely noticed in isolation. And in early human life, where exposure to changing temperatures was part of daily existence, this pattern would have repeated often, not as a dramatic event, but as a background condition that shaped how long the feet could remain comfortable in one place, how quickly they responded to cooler surfaces, and how the body adjusted without forming a clear boundary between comfort and discomfort, because the transition was gradual, and that gradual quality is important, since it allows the body to keep functioning while conditions slowly shift. And it is within that slow shift that the limits of natural insulation become clear, because the skin of the foot, even when thickened, does not trap air in the same way that fur or layered coverings can, and without trapped air, there is little resistance to the movement of heat outward, and so the foot remains a surface through which warmth passes rather than a barrier that holds it. And this again returns us to the idea that the human body does not solve every problem at the level of anatomy alone, but often manages them through behavior, through movement, through changes in position, through timing, and through the eventual use of external materials. And before those materials became consistent, the body itself carried most of the burden, relying on what it could adjust in the moment rather than what it could permanently change. And in that context, the feet reveal something broader about human adaptation, because they show that survival does not always require perfect design in every part, but a system that can continue working even when certain elements remain exposed, and the exposure of the feet to cold ground is one of those elements, a condition that persists not because it is ideal, but because it does not prevent movement, does not prevent basic function, and therefore does not force a complete redesign, And if we imagine early humans moving through varied landscapes over long periods, carrying this same structure with them, we begin to see that the problem of warmth at the foot was never isolated. It was connected to circulation, to body priorities, to the demands of locomotion, and to the limits of what the body could change without losing something else in return. And this brings the focus gently back to the central question. Because if the feet were always part of a system that could manage, but not fully prevent heat loss, then the inability to keep them warm was not a single failure, but the natural result of a body shaped by many needs at once, where warmth at the edge was one of the few things that could be reduced without stopping the journey entirely. For much of early human life, the contact between foot and ground was not an occasional inconvenience but an ordinary condition of existence, because there was no stable layer placed between the body and the earth, no dependable covering that could be assumed at every step. And this matters because it changes the question from one of comfort to one of necessity, since early humans did not first possess warm, insulated feet and then lose that protection. Nor did they move through the world with modern expectations of separation from the land beneath them, but instead lived in a long reality where the foot met the ground directly as part of daily survival, while searching, walking, carrying, pausing, climbing, and resting. And this directness was not a dramatic feature of life so much as a constant one, woven into movement so deeply that it would have shaped the body's experience from the beginning, without needing to be noticed in every moment. And when we look back toward the earliest human origins in Africa, where upright walking became central long before any consistent evidence of tailored footwear, we are looking at bodies that were already committed to locomotion across open surfaces, while still relying mainly on anatomy and behavior rather than on durable external insulation at the foot. And that means the basic thermal problem was built into ordinary movement itself, because each step required exposure, and each exposed step allowed warmth to pass into whatever surface happened to be underfoot, whether dry soil, packed earth, rough stone, morning ground that had not yet warmed, or damp places that pulled heat more quickly from living tissue. And although later humans in some regions almost certainly experimented with simple wrappings, plant materials, hides, or temporary protections when conditions demanded it, those solutions do not change the broader pattern, which is that for a vast stretch of human existence, walking barefoot or near barefoot was not a rare hardship, but the default state from which any protection would have been partial, inconsistent, and dependent on local materials, skill, season, and circumstance. And once that is understood, the feet begin to look less like neglected parts of the body and more like working surfaces that had no choice but to endure direct contact over and over again. And endurance is not the same thing as warmth, because a foot can remain useful while gradually cooling, can continue stepping while losing heat, can carry the body far without ever becoming thermally secure. And that distinction is important for this title, because it helps explain why early humans could keep moving even when they could not fully keep their feet warm. And it also reminds us that necessity often preserves a problem rather than solving it, since the need to travel across the land did not wait for the development of complete barriers against cold surfaces, and so the body continued doing what it could under conditions that were never fully comfortable. And this gives the story a different shape from the idea of progress as a steady removal of hardship, because in this earlier world, movement came first, and protection, when it existed at all, remained limited and uneven, especially at the foot, where contact with the ground could not simply be eliminated without changing how one moved through rough and changing terrain, and that terrain itself mattered, because it was not only the coldest environments that created the problem, but the repeated fact that the ground was often cooler than the body, especially at night, in shade, after rain, at dawn, or during seasonal changes, and when that cooler ground met bare skin directly day after day, it created a quiet continuity of loss, not enough to stop the journey, but enough to shape it, enough to make the feet a place where the human body's dependence on the earth became physically unavoidable. And perhaps that is the deepest point here, that early humans were not living above the ground but with it. And in that closeness the foot remained exposed not because the problem was unimportant, but because life itself kept requiring the very contact that allowed the warmth to leave. When the foot remains in direct contact with the ground, not just for moments but as a repeated condition across days and seasons, it begins to shape a pattern that is less about isolated exposure and more about continuity, because early humans did not move through controlled environments where surfaces could be chosen for comfort. They moved through landscapes that changed constantly, and each change carried its own effect on how heat moved between body and earth, sometimes slowly, sometimes more quickly, but always in the same direction, from warmth toward coolness. And this matters because it removes the idea that cold feet were only a problem in rare or extreme conditions. Instead, it becomes something quieter and more persistent, present whenever the ground held less heat than the body, which is often the case in natural settings, especially during the early hours of the day, after rain, in shaded areas, or in regions where the soil retains moisture, and moisture itself plays a role that is easy to overlook, because damp surfaces can draw heat away more efficiently than dry ones, meaning that two places that feel similar at first contact may affect the body differently over time. And early humans, moving across such varied terrain, would have encountered these differences not as abstract knowledge but as repeated physical experiences, shaping how the body responded even without conscious planning. And this brings attention to another detail, that the human foot is not a passive surface but an active one, adjusting pressure, distributing weight, shifting position with each step, and these adjustments help maintain balance and forward motion, yet they do not interrupt the flow of heat into the ground, because contact remains constant even as it changes in small ways, and so the body remains engaged in two processes at once, one of movement and one of loss. And while movement generates some internal warmth, it does not fully replace what is being transferred away through repeated contact, especially over long periods. And this creates a steady imbalance that does not grow large enough to stop activity, but remains present enough to influence how long certain conditions can be tolerated. And if we consider this within the broader context of early human behavior, it suggests that the experience of walking was never entirely separate from the experience of the ground itself, because the ground was not only something to move across but something that acted back on the body, shaping temperature, sensation, and endurance at the same time. And this interaction becomes even more apparent when movement slows or pauses, because the subtle warmth generated by activity fades while the ground continues its quiet exchange, and the feet, having been exposed throughout the movement, begin to reflect that change more clearly, transitioning from neutral contact to a cooler state that builds gradually. And this gradual nature is important, because it allows the body to keep functioning without immediate interruption, but it also means that the condition is never fully resolved, only managed, and over time, such management becomes part of the background of life, not a problem that appears and disappears, but one that is always present to some degree, depending on where one stands, walks, or rests. And this leads to a broader understanding that the inability to keep the feet warm was not a single environmental challenge that could be avoided by choosing different paths, but a continuous feature of living close to the ground, where every surface had its own thermal character, and where the human body, without a consistent barrier, remained open to those variations, adapting moment by moment without ever closing the gap completely between its own warmth and the cooler world beneath it. Over a long enough span of time, what begins as direct contact becomes a kind of inheritance, not passed through memory and words, but carried through the repeated conditions of life, because when generation after generation moves across exposed ground without any stable barrier at the foot, the experience of warmth leaving through that contact becomes part of the ordinary background of being human, and this helps explain why the problem did not appear to early humans as a special event requiring a complete solution, but as one of many quiet limits built into daily existence, since a body can continue to live with a condition that it cannot fully remove, especially when that condition does not stop movement altogether, and in this case the feet remained useful, sensitive, and capable even while exposed, which meant that direct contact with the ground persisted not because it was ideal but because it was workable. And what is workable often lasts for a very long time in human history, particularly in the earliest periods when survival depended more on endurance and adaptation than on the consistent reshaping of the environment. And if we think again about the origins of human life in African landscapes, where upright walking became central, the point becomes clearer, because the foot emerged within settings where the body's relationship to the ground was constant and intimate, shaped by movement over natural terrain rather than by insulation from it. And from that beginning, the human line carried forward a foot already committed to contact, already specialized for balance and travel, long before any reliable protection at the sole became widespread. And as later populations moved into cooler, more seasonal and more variable regions, that same basic structure traveled with them, still capable, still flexible, still enduring, but still open to heat loss from below. And this continuity matters because it shows that the problem was never limited to one climate or one dramatic landscape, but followed the body wherever the ground remained cooler than living tissue, which is true in far more places than it first seems, on early morning earth, on shaded soil, on damp river margins, on stone that held the memory of night, on packed surfaces after rain, and on any terrain where contact lasted long enough for the slow transfer of warmth to continue. And the body, faced with this constant exchange, did what it often does, not solving the issue completely through anatomy, but managing it through motion, posture, timing, and whatever small adjustments were available. And those adjustments may have helped reduce discomfort, but they did not remove the underlying fact that the feet remained exposed at the point where the human body met the world most directly. And in that exposure, there is something revealing about the larger human story, because it reminds us that adaptation is not the same as perfection, and that some of the most important human abilities developed alongside unresolved costs, not after they had been eliminated. And the feet are a quiet example of this, since they made long movement possible while never fully escaping the thermal burden created by the same contact that made such movement effective. And perhaps that is why this question feels deeper than it first appears, because it is not only about cold feet, but about the kind of body humans became, a body that could travel far, occupy many landscapes, and survive difficult conditions while still carrying certain unfinished edges. And the feet seemed to belong to those edges, where function outran comfort, where endurance mattered more than insulation, and where the human relationship to the ground remained close enough that warmth could always pass outward with each step, each pause, and each night spent near the earth. And once this is understood, the title begins to settle into a calmer and more precise meaning, because early humans could not keep their feet warm not simply because they lacked protection, but because for much of their history the life they lived required direct contact with a cooler world, and the body they carried into that world was built to continue through that contact, not to escape it entirely. It is easy for the mind to imagine cold as something that falls from above, from wind across the skin, from night air moving around the body, from open darkness pressing down over an exposed landscape, and this way of imagining it feels natural because the upper body senses air so quickly. The face notices coolness almost at once, the arms and shoulders respond to wind, and the whole body seems to read cold as an atmosphere surrounding it. Yet for early humans, another part of the story remained quieter and more constant, because even when the air itself was not severe, the ground beneath the body could continue drawing heat away with remarkable steadiness. And this matters because air and ground do not cool the body in the same way, since air can move around the skin, sometimes colder, sometimes calmer, sometimes interrupted by shelter, posture, or the heat retained near the body, while the ground, once touched directly, becomes a fixed pathway through which warmth can leave by simple contact, and contact has a kind of silence to it, because it does not need strong wind, dramatic weather, or extreme temperatures to matter. It only needs a body warmer than the surface below, and as long as that difference remains, heat continues to move downward, slowly, but without argument. And for early humans whose feet met soil, stone, mud, grass, and packed earth again and again, this meant that the coldest challenge was not always something descending from the sky, but something waiting under every step, under every pause, under every night spent close to the earth. And this shifts the question in an important way, because it means keeping the feet warm was never only about surviving bad weather. It was also about resisting the ordinary physical fact that the planet under the body was usually less warm than the body itself, especially after sunset, before sunrise, in shade, after rain, or across surfaces that held little heat of their own. And when we return in thought to the earlier origins of the human body, to people moving through open African environments where the human form first developed before later populations spread into colder and more seasonal lands, we can see that this problem begins at a very basic level. because the foot is the place where the living body gives its weight to the non-living world, and wherever that exchange happens, warmth can follow weight into the ground, and unlike the upper body, which can sometimes reduce exposure by turning away from wind, crouching, seeking cover, or drawing limbs inward, the foot has fewer choices, because to stand is to touch, to walk is to repeat that touch, and to rest is often to let that contact continue longer. And this makes downward heat loss especially difficult to escape, not because it is always intense, but because it is built into the mechanics of being upright and mobile. And that may be why it remains such a persistent problem, since the human body could respond to cold air through posture, movement, clustering, fire when available, and later through coverings, but the ground remained a different kind of opponent, one that did not blow past and disappear, one that waited in stillness and accepted warmth continuously wherever the skin met it. And even simple shelter did not always solve this, because a roof can reduce wind and a wall can soften exposure, yet neither changes the fact that the body still depends on support from below, and if that support remains cold, then the loss continues at the lowest edge of the body, often unnoticed until it has already built into discomfort, and this gives the feet a special place in the larger history of human warmth, because they were asked to do more than endure the weather. They were asked to endure the earth itself, and the earth does not need to feel hostile to take heat away. It only needs to remain what it is, cooler, denser, and always ready to receive the warmth of a body that cannot move through the world without touching it. Once this quiet difference between air and ground is noticed, the experience of cold begins to change its meaning, because it is no longer something that arrives only when the weather turns harsh, but something that can exist even in conditions that seem mild. And this is especially true for the feet, where contact creates a steady channel for heat to move downward. And unlike air, which can warm slightly near the skin or be reduced through small changes in posture, the ground remains a more stable presence, often holding a lower temperature for longer periods, particularly in the early hours before sunlight has time to raise its warmth, or in shaded places where heat never fully accumulates. And this stability makes the ground a consistent receiver of warmth, not because it actively pulls it away with force, but because it simply allows the transfer to continue without interruption. And for early humans moving through such environments, this meant that even when the air felt manageable, the feet could still gradually cool, creating a separation between what the upper body sensed and what the lower body experienced. And that separation may not have been sharp or immediate, but over time it becomes noticeable, especially when movement slows and the subtle warmth generated by activity begins to fade. And in those moments the feet reveal something that the rest of the body may not yet feel, a quiet imbalance between internal warmth and external contact. And this imbalance is shaped by more than just temperature alone, because the nature of the surface also matters, with dense materials like stone or compact earth tending to conduct heat more steadily than loose, dry soil, and with dampness adding another layer to the process, allowing heat to move more efficiently through contact. And these variations mean that two places that appear similar at a glance can affect the body very differently over time. And early humans, without consistent barriers at the foot, would have encountered these differences directly, learning them not as abstract categories but as repeated physical patterns that influence where it was easier or harder to remain still, where movement felt more comfortable, and where rest became more difficult to sustain. And yet even with this variability, the underlying condition remained the same, that the feet were always part of a system in contact with a surface that did not return warmth. And this is important because it shows that the problem was not limited to extreme cold or rare environments, but existed wherever the ground held less heat than the body, which is a common condition across many natural settings. And this continuity helps explain why the issue was never fully removed through simple adaptation, since the body could adjust to changes in air through movement, posture, and later through coverings, but it could not remove the need for contact with the ground, and without removing that contact, the pathway for heat loss remained open, shaping the experience of standing, walking, and resting in ways that were often subtle but always present. And if we imagine early humans at the beginning of each day, stepping onto surfaces that had cooled through the night, or pausing in shaded areas where warmth never fully gathered, we begin to see how this pattern repeated again and again, not as a dramatic challenge, but as a quiet condition that followed every step, reminding us that the difficulty of keeping the feet warm was not only about surviving cold air, but about living on a surface that continually accepted warmth without giving it back. For early humans, this quiet downward loss of warmth may have been one of the least dramatic and most persistent pressures in ordinary life, because it did not arrive with the force of a storm or the sharp warning of pain, but instead worked through repetition, through simple contact, through the long fact that the body had to stand somewhere, walk somewhere, and eventually rest somewhere. And in each of those moments, the ground remained the same kind of presence, cooler than the body, denser than the air, and always able to receive heat through touch. And this helps explain why keeping the feet warm was never only a matter of enduring weather. Since weather changes, wind rises and falls, sunlight comes and goes, but the earth below the body remains the constant partner in every movement. And when that constant partner stays cooler than living tissue, the transfer continues whether it is noticed or not. And this is what makes heat loss from below so quietly important, because it is built into the most ordinary mechanics of human life, not only in cold seasons or in harsh regions, but whenever a human body without reliable insulation at the foot meets a surface that has retained less warmth than the blood and tissue above it. And in this sense, the difficulty begins before the feeling, because the physical exchange starts first, and only after some time does sensation begin to follow, moving from neutral contact to coolness, from coolness to distraction, and from distraction to the small restlessness that makes stillness harder to maintain. And this matters because early humans did not live above the land in the way many modern people do, separated by raised floors, layered materials and constant coverings, but close to it, dependent on it, exposed to its textures and temperatures at every step. And that closeness meant the feet were always the first to register what the ground was doing, often before the rest of the body fully recognized the shift. And that makes the feet more than simple tools of movement, as they become early points of negotiation between body heat and environmental reality, sensing and losing at the same time, feeling the surface while giving warmth to it. And this dual role may be one reason the problem endured for so long, because a foot that must remain sensitive and flexible cannot easily become a sealed barrier against the conditions it must detect, and so the body continues with a compromise, gaining the ability to travel, balance, and adjust over rough terrain, while accepting that the lowest edge of the body will remain one of the easiest places for warmth to leave. And once that compromise is understood, the title begins to feel less like a narrow question about cold, and more like a window into the structure of human life itself. Because the issue is not that early humans failed to keep their feet warm in a few difficult moments, but that the body they carried through the world was never fully arranged to stop this kind of loss at its source. And if we return once more to the longer beginning of the human story, to bodies first shaped for upright movement in African landscapes before later expansions into colder and more seasonal places, we can see how a form built around long walking and ground contact would carry its basic design forward even as conditions changed. And that means the feet entered many later environments with the same strengths and the same unfinished limits, still able to move far, still able to endure much but still giving heat away wherever contact with cooler ground lasted long enough. And perhaps this is why the earth itself deserves more attention in the story of human warmth, because it is easy to fear the sky, to think first of wind, rain and night air, but the lower world beneath the body may have been just as important, precisely because it was so ordinary, so silent, and so difficult to escape. And when early humans could not keep their feet warm, it was not only because cold surrounded them, but because the ground beneath them participated in that cold with every step, every pause, and every moment of rest, receiving warmth so steadily that the body could manage the loss, endure the loss, and live with the loss, without ever fully ending it. For early humans, the problem was not simply that some places were cold, but that most natural ground was almost always cooler than the body itself. And this difference, even when it was not extreme, was enough to create a steady transfer of heat from foot to earth, because warmth does not wait for dramatic weather before it begins to move. It only follows the basic rule that heat passes from what is warmer to what is cooler. And once the foot touches the ground directly, that rule begins to operate at once, whether the person is aware of it or not. And this is important because it means the loss of warmth did not depend only on frozen landscapes or severe winters, but could happen on ordinary surfaces in ordinary conditions, on packed soil before the day had fully warmed, on stone that had cooled during the night, on damp ground near water, on shaded earth under trees, and on open land where the sun had already fallen but the body still carried the heat of recent movement. And when we imagine early humans living close to such surfaces every day, walking, pausing, crouching, resting, and rising again, we begin to see that the real issue was not an occasional encounter with cold, but a long relationship with a world that usually remained thermally lower than the body. And because the feet were the point of direct contact, they became the place where that relationship was felt most clearly, not through sudden failure, but through quiet repetition, through the simple fact that the body could not stand on a surface without slowly giving something to it. And this helps explain why the feet so often remained behind the rest of the body in warmth, because even when the air was manageable, even when movement produced internal heat, the ground continued receiving what the feet could not fully hold. And this quiet imbalance would have followed early humans across many kinds of terrain, since the Earth is rarely a neutral surface in thermal terms, and even small differences in temperature matter when contact lasts long enough, which means that a surface does not need to feel sharply cold to begin taking heat from living tissue. It only needs to be less warm than the body, and in the long history of human origins, beginning in African environments where upright walking first became central, that condition would already have existed in many ordinary settings, because morning earth, shaded soil, wet patches, caves, river margins, and nighttime ground all hold less warmth than the body that touches them. And later, as human groups spread into more seasonal and colder regions, this old bodily condition did not disappear. It simply entered landscapes, where the difference between body and ground could grow even larger, making a long-standing issue more difficult rather than creating it from nothing. And this is one reason the title reaches deeper than it first seems, because it is not only asking why some early humans in harsh places had cold feet, but why the human foot itself remained exposed to a thermal world that was almost always below it in temperature. And one answer begins here, in the quiet truth that the ground did not need to be hostile to take warmth away. It only needed to be itself, a mass of earth, stone, moisture, and shadow that held heat differently from flesh and blood. And the foot, lacking thick natural insulation, met that mass directly again and again. And there is something revealing in that repetition, because it shows that the struggle to keep feet warm did not come only from dramatic climates, but from the ordinary physics of living close to the land, where the ground beneath the body was nearly always a little cooler, a little denser, and a little more ready to receive heat than the body was ready to lose it. And once that point is understood, the problem no longer looks like an exception in human life, but like a quiet rule beneath it, one that followed every step and every pause, and one that made warmth at the foot less a stable possession than something constantly slipping downward into the world below. Once this quiet difference between body and ground is understood as something that exists almost everywhere, it becomes easier to see how small variations in the surface itself can change the pace of heat loss without ever removing it, because the Earth is not a single uniform material. It is a shifting combination of soil, stone, moisture, and air trapped within it, and each of these elements affects how quickly warmth can pass from the foot into the ground, sometimes slowing the process slightly, sometimes allowing it to move more freely, but never fully stopping it as long as direct contact remains. And this means that early humans were not only dealing with the fact that the ground was usually cooler than their bodies, but also with the fact that the rate of heat loss could change from one step to the next, creating a subtle but continuous variation in how the feet experience the world. And one of the most important factors in this variation is density, because a firm, compact surface such as packed earth or stone tends to carry heat away more steadily than loose. Dry soil, which contains small pockets of air that can slow the transfer. And yet, even in those slower conditions, the direction of heat flow does not reverse. It only becomes less immediate, and this difference may not be obvious at first contact, but over time it shapes how long the feet can remain comfortable in one place, and how quickly they begin to cool when movement slows. And another factor that quietly changes the experience is moisture, because water conducts heat more effectively than air, and when the ground is damp, whether from rain, proximity to water, or natural humidity, it can draw warmth from the foot more efficiently. creating a stronger and more persistent cooling effect, even if the surface does not feel sharply cold at the moment of contact. And this is important because it shows that the problem of keeping the feet warm was not only about temperature in the narrow sense, but about the condition of the ground itself, its structure, its composition, and its relationship to the surrounding environment. And early humans, moving through such varied terrain, would have encountered these differences not as isolated events, but as part of a continuous experience, where the body adjusted from one surface to another without ever finding a stable condition in which heat loss simply stopped. And this variability adds another layer to the difficulty, because it prevents the body from settling into a single pattern of response, instead requiring constant adjustment, small shifts in movement, posture, and timing that help manage the condition without fully resolving it. And if we imagine early humans at the beginning of the day, stepping onto ground that has cooled overnight, then moving across drier surfaces as the sun rises, then perhaps crossing damp areas near water, and later resting on soil that again begins to lose heat as evening approaches, we can begin to see how this pattern repeats across time, creating a rhythm of slight warming and cooling that never reaches a point of complete stability at the foot. And this rhythm does not need to be dramatic to matter, because over long periods it shapes the overall experience of being in contact with the earth, and it reinforces the idea that the feet were always part of a dynamic exchange rather than a fixed state, always giving something away while continuing to function. And this brings the focus back to the central question in a quieter but clearer way. Because if the ground is almost always cooler than the body, and if its structure can change how quickly heat is lost without ever stopping that loss, then the difficulty early humans faced was not only that their feet were exposed, but that the surface they depended on was constantly shifting in ways that made warmth hardening that hold, and in that shifting, the simple act of standing or walking becomes part of a larger process, where the body meets a world that is never entirely aligned with its need to retain heat, and where the feet, as the point of contact, carry that misalignment with every step. When these differences in the ground repeat over long periods, they begin to form a kind of quiet rhythm that the body moves through without ever fully controlling. Because early humans did not choose a single surface and remain on it, they crossed many, sometimes within a short distance, sometimes across the span of a day, and each surface carried its own way of receiving heat, sometimes slowly, sometimes more steadily, sometimes with the added effect of moisture. And this means that the experience of warmth at the foot was never fixed, but always shifting, never completely stable, and this instability matters because the body cannot settle into a single state when the conditions beneath it keep changing. And instead of solving the problem, it learns to continue through it, adjusting step by step, moment by moment, without ever reaching a point where the feet are fully protected from loss. And over time, this creates a pattern that is easy to overlook because it does not demand attention all at once. It builds gradually, through small differences that accumulate, through the repeated fact that even a slightly cooler surface will continue to take warmth as long as contact lasts. And if we imagine early humans moving through their environments at the beginning of human history, when the body first took its present form in African landscapes, we can see that this pattern would already have been present, because the ground in those environments was not uniform, not constantly warm, but varied by shade, by time of day, by moisture, and by the simple passage of night into morning. And from that beginning, as humans later moved into regions with wider seasonal changes, colder climates, and longer periods where the ground held even less warmth, the same basic relationship continued, only under conditions that made the difference more noticeable. And this continuity is important, because it shows that the problem did not begin in one place or one climate. It followed the body wherever it went, carried forward by the same need to remain in contact with the earth, and shaped by the same inability to fully prevent heat from leaving through that contact. And there is something revealing in the fact that this never fully changed at the level of the body itself, because it suggests that the human form was already committed to a certain balance, one where movement, balance, and sensitivity were preserved, even if it meant allowing warmth to be lost at the point of contact. And that balance did not need to be perfect to support survival. It only needed to be sufficient, and in that sufficiency, the feet could continue to function across many kinds of terrain while remaining exposed to the same underlying process And if we return again to the simple act of placing the foot on the ground, we begin to see it differently, not as a neutral contact, but as part of a larger exchange that is always in motion, always shaped by the surface beneath, and always limited by the fact that the ground does not adjust itself to the needs of the body, but remains what it is, cooler, denser, and able to receive heat whenever it is offered. And this may be why the difficulty of keeping the feet warm feels so persistent across time, because it is not tied to a single moment of hardship, but to a continuous condition, one that follows every step, every pause, and every change in terrain, and one that reveals a quiet truth about early human life, that even as the body adapted to move across the world, it did so while remaining open to the small but constant loss that came with touching that world directly. Movement seems at first like the body's natural answer to cold, because a moving body produces heat, muscles work, blood travels more actively, and the stillness that allows cold to settle is interrupted by effort. So it is easy to imagine that early humans could simply walk their way out of the problem, warming the feet by keeping them in motion, and there is some truth in that, since movement does help, not by sealing the foot against the ground, but by increasing the warmth available within the body itself, giving the feet a better supply of heat than they would have during rest. And in that sense, walking is not nothing. It changes the balance for a while, it delays discomfort, it keeps the body from sinking too quickly into a cooler state, yet this help has limits, and those limits become clear the moment we remember that the feet do not stop touching the ground while moving. They touch it again and again, hundreds and thousands of times, and with each contact the same exchange continues, warmth leaving the body and passing into whatever surface lies below, whether soil, stone, packed earth, or damp ground. So movement does not remove the pathway of heat loss. It only tries to outrun it by generating warmth faster than it is being given away. And that is a very different thing from solving it, because outrunning a loss is never the same as closing it. And over long stretches of time the difference matters, especially in the lives of early humans, whose movement was not a brief exercise but a practical condition of survival, woven into searching, following, carrying, travelling, and enduring across landscapes that did not pause their effect on the body, simply because the body kept moving through them, and this means that every step carried a double truth at once, the body making heat through effort, while the feet continued to lose some of that heat through contact. And for a time, the first process may have balanced, the second, well enough to keep the feet serviceable and less noticeable, but balance is not victory, because the moment effort slows, the assistance from movement begins to fade while the ground remains exactly where it was, still cooler, still able to receive heat, still present under the body, and even during movement itself the balance is imperfect, because the foot spends part of each step in contact with the ground and part of each step lifting from it, and this rhythm does not eliminate loss, it only interrupts it briefly before returning to it again, which is enough to help somewhat but never enough to create lasting warmth at the point of contact. And if we think back to the deeper human beginning, to bodies shaped first in African environments where upright walking became central long before stable insulation at the feet, this compromise appears almost built into the story from the start, because the human body did not develop as a creature that remained warm by avoiding contact with the earth, but as one that kept moving across it, relying on activity, posture, and later on shelter and coverings when possible, rather than on a foot naturally protected from the thermal cost of ground contact. And that helps explain why early humans may have managed the problem through movement without ever truly ending it, since movement could preserve function and delay cooling, but it could not make the foot into something it was not, a naturally insulated barrier against a cooler surface. And once humans moved into more seasonal and colder regions, the same logic would have remained, only with a sharper difference between body warmth and ground temperature, making the limits of movement even more visible, because there comes a point where walking keeps the body going but does not keep the feet fully warm, where activity supports endurance but cannot erase the slow outward flow of heat. And this is perhaps the quiet lesson hidden in the act of walking itself, that for early humans movement was not a cure for cold feet, but a negotiation with them, a way of holding the problem at a manageable distance for a while, never fully defeating it, never fully escaping the fact that the same contact required for travel was also the contact through which warmth continued to leave. Even when movement helps the body stay warm for a time, it does so unevenly because the warmth created by effort is not distributed in the same way throughout the body, and the feet, being far from the center where heat is generated and maintained, do not always receive the full benefit of that increase, and this creates a quiet separation between what the body is doing and what the feet are experiencing. Since the muscles of the legs may be active, the body may feel engaged, and yet the lowest points of contact can still remain cooler than expected, and this is not a contradiction, but a reflection of how heat moves within the body, because warmth must travel through circulation, and circulation does not treat every region equally, especially when conditions encourage the body to protect its core, and so even during sustained movement, when heat is being produced, the feet can remain at the edge of that system, receiving enough warmth to continue functioning, but not always enough to fully balance what is being lost to the ground below. And this becomes more noticeable over time, as movement continues and contact with the ground repeats, because each step renews the exchange. Each pause within the step allows heat to pass downward again, and while the body keeps generating warmth, the ground keeps receiving it, and the two processes remain linked but not perfectly matched. And this imbalance is subtle. It does not stop the body from moving, it does not create immediate failure, but it shapes endurance in a quieter way, influencing how long movement can feel sustainable before small discomforts begin to appear. And those discomforts are not only about sensation, but about the body's ongoing attempt to maintain balance between what it produces and what it loses. And if we imagine early humans moving across long distances, across changing terrain, across surfaces that differ in how they accept heat, we can begin to see how this pattern would repeat again and again, not as a single challenge to overcome, but as a continuous condition to manage. And management, in this sense, means adjusting pace, shifting weight, altering posture slightly, perhaps choosing when to pause and when to continue, not to eliminate the loss of warmth, but to keep it within a range that allows movement to go on. And this brings attention to another limit of movement as a solution, which is that it cannot be sustained without interruption, because even the most enduring body must eventually slow, must rest, must reduce effort, and in those moments the support that movement provides begins to fade, and what remains is the underlying condition, the direct contact between foot and ground, still present, still active, and often more noticeable now that internal heat production has decreased. And this is where the boundary of movement becomes clear, because it can delay the experience of cooling, but it cannot replace the need for warmth when the body is no longer generating it through activity. And if we return once more to the earliest phases of human life, to bodies first shaped for long-distance walking in African environments, before expanding into colder and more variable regions, we can see that this reliance on movement as a partial solution was likely present from the beginning, because the body did not evolve with a fully insulated foot that could remain warm in stillness, but with a system that could continue through exposure as long as it kept working. And that system works well enough for survival, but not well enough to remove the quiet cost entirely. And so the feet remain a place where movement and loss exist together, where the effort of walking supports warmth without securing it, and where the act of continuing forward becomes part of how the body lives with a condition it cannot fully change. There is a point where movement no longer feels like an answer, but becomes part of the limit itself. And that point often appears not during the first steps, but later, when the body has already been in motion for some time, when effort has become steady rather than new, and when the quiet exchange between foot and ground has been repeating long enough to shape the internal balance of warmth. Because even though movement produces heat, it also requires contact, and contact is the condition through which heat continues to leave, and so the very act that helps delay cooling also ensures that the pathway for loss never closes, and this creates a kind of circular condition, where movement supports the body but cannot free it from the surface it depends on, and over longer periods this becomes more noticeable, not as a sudden failure, but as a gradual narrowing of what movement can provide. Because the body cannot increase its heat production indefinitely, and the feet cannot reduce their contact with the ground without changing the way the body moves. And this means there is a natural boundary to how much movement can compensate for exposure. And once that boundary is reached, the difference between internal warmth and external contact begins to show itself more clearly. especially when the rhythm of walking slows, when pauses become longer, or when the body begins to conserve energy rather than spend it. And in these moments, the support that movement once provided fades quietly, leaving the feet once again fully open to the steady influence of the ground. And this pattern would have repeated often in early human life, not as an unusual event, but as part of the daily cycle of activity and rest, where movement could carry the body forward and delay cooling for a time, but could not maintain warmth indefinitely. And this is important because it shows that the solution was never simply to keep moving, since life itself required moments of stillness, moments of waiting, moments of recovery, and in those moments the underlying condition returned, unchanged, continuing from where it had never truly stopped. And if we think back to the earliest human environments, where the body first took its present form before expanding into colder regions, we can see that this relationship between movement and loss was already established, because the foot was designed to support long travel, not to remain warm during prolonged contact, and that design carried forward into every later environment, where the same pattern would become more visible as the difference between body and ground increased. And so the limitation of movement becomes clearer over time, not because movement fails, but because it was never meant to solve the problem completely, only to help the body continue despite it. And this distinction matters because it shifts the question from why early humans did not simply move more to stay warm, to why the body relied on movement as a partial answer instead of developing a more complete protection at the foot. And the answer begins to emerge in the idea that movement itself was already the priority, already the condition that had to be preserved, and anything that reduced the foot's ability to move, to feel, and to adapt to the ground would have come with its own cost, and so the body remained as it was, capable of travelling far while carrying this quiet imbalance within it. And if we follow that thought to its end, we begin to see that early humans could not keep their feet warm not because they lacked effort or endurance, but because the very act of enduring required them to remain in contact with a surface that steadily received their warmth, and no amount of movement could fully separate those two things: the need to keep going and the cost of touching the ground that made going possible. Night changed the meaning of cold, not because it introduced an entirely new problem, but because it removed many of the small supports that helped the body manage the old one during the day. And for the feet, this difference could become especially clear, because daylight often comes with movement, with changing tasks, with sunlight warming exposed surfaces, and with the body generating heat through effort, while night brings a different rhythm, one in which activity slows. The ground releases the heat it gathered earlier, and the body spends longer periods in stillness. And once stillness begins, the balance that movement had been holding together starts to weaken, because the feet remain in contact with surfaces that are now often cooler than they were before, while the warmth produced from walking or working gradually fades. And this means that the same foot that could remain serviceable through the day may begin to cool more noticeably after sunset, not because the anatomy has changed, but because the conditions around it have shifted in a direction that exposes its limits more clearly. And this matters in early human life because night was not a simple opposite of day. It was a period with its own physical demands, and among those demands was the need to remain near the ground for longer stretches of time, whether sitting, crouching, standing in place, or eventually resting, and each of those positions allowed contact to continue while reducing the body's ability to replace what was being lost. And there is something quiet but important in that change, because the feet do not suddenly fail at night. They simply lose the support of daylight conditions one piece at a time. First the warmth of active movement, then the lingering heat in the ground, then the subtle rise in surface temperature created by the sun, and what remains is a body whose lowest points are still required to touch a cooler world, while no longer receiving enough help to disguise the cost of that contact. And if we return in thought to the older beginnings of human life, to the African landscapes where upright walking became central before later humans moved into more seasonal and colder places, we can see that night would already have been a meaningful shift even there, because the ground after sunset does not need to become extreme to matter. It only needs to fall below the temperature of the body and stay there, and that is often enough to begin the same steady transfer of warmth from foot to earth, a transfer made more obvious now that the body is quieter, and the time of contact may be longer. And as human groups later entered colder regions, longer winters, and landscapes where nighttime cooling could become more severe. The pattern itself did not change, only its intensity, and that continuity is important because it keeps the story grounded, reminding us that the feet were never only challenged by rare hardship, but by an ordinary transition that returned every day, the turning of light into dark, activity into rest, surface warmth into surface coolness. And this daily return may have made night one of the clearest moments in which the human foot revealed what it could not naturally do, which was hold warmth for long once the world below began to cool and the body above began to slow. And that may be why the title begins to feel even more precise here, because early humans could not keep their feet warm not only because the ground was cooler in general, but because night made the ongoing imbalance harder to ignore, taking away the small daytime advantages and leaving the feet exposed to the most ordinary and persistent fact of all, that the earth beneath them continued receiving warmth long after the body had begun to settle into darkness. As night deepens, the change is not only in light, but in the way the body must remain still for longer periods, and this stillness reveals something that movement had been quietly balancing during the day, because when the body stops producing steady heat through activity, the difference between internal warmth and external contact becomes more exposed, and the feet, already in direct contact with the ground, begin to reflect that difference more clearly, not all at once, but through a gradual shift that builds over time. And this is important because early humans did not rest on raised or insulated surfaces in any consistent way, but close to the earth itself, sometimes on soil, sometimes on stone, sometimes on materials gathered from the surrounding environment, and even when those materials provided some separation, they rarely formed a complete barrier against the steady transfer of heat. And so the condition that had been present during movement did not disappear at night. It simply changed form, becoming more continuous and less interrupted, because instead of brief, repeated contacts with the ground during walking, the feet could remain in contact for longer, more stable periods. And in that stability, the process of heat loss becomes more noticeable as the body no longer offsets it through motion, and the ground, having cooled through the absence of sunlight, continues to receive warmth without interruption, and this creates a quiet progression from comfort toward coolness that is not dramatic enough to demand immediate action, but steady enough to shape how rest is experienced, because the body may seek stillness, yet the feet remain engaged in a process that does not pause simply because the person has chosen to stop moving. And this introduces a subtle tension, not one that prevents rest entirely, but one that makes it less stable, encouraging small adjustments, slight movements, changes in position that attempt to reduce the effect without fully removing it. And these adjustments do not need to be conscious or deliberate to matter. They can be simple responses to discomfort, shifting weight, drawing the feet closer, placing them on different surfaces, or adjusting posture in ways that alter how contact is distributed. And through these small actions, the body continues to manage a condition it cannot fully eliminate, and this pattern would have repeated night after night in early human life, not as a rare challenge, but as part of the ordinary rhythm of day and darkness, where movement gave way to stillness and stillness revealed what movement had been helping to conceal. And if we think again about the earlier origins of the human body, in African environments where upright walking first defined the form before later expansions into colder regions, we can see that even there the transition from day to night would have brought a similar shift, because the ground after sunset does not retain the same warmth it held under direct sunlight. And once that warmth fades, the difference between body and surface becomes more pronounced, allowing heat to pass more steadily into the earth. And as human groups later entered regions where nighttime temperatures could fall further and remain low for longer, this same pattern would have become more intense, but not fundamentally different, and that continuity helps explain why the difficulty of keeping the feet warm was not tied to a single environment, but to a repeating condition that returned every evening, shaped by the same elements of stillness, surface temperature, and prolonged contact. And within that repetition, the feet remained one of the clearest points where the limits of the body could be felt, not as a sudden failure, but as a quiet boundary between what the body could maintain through effort and what it could not fully preserve once that effort came to rest. As night continues, the difficulty does not come from a single moment of cold, but from the length of time over which the body must remain still while the ground continues its quiet exchange. Because early humans were not only exposed to cooler surfaces after sunset, they were also required to stay in contact with those surfaces for longer periods. And this combination creates a condition that is very different from the short, repeated contacts of movement, since during walking each step lifts the foot briefly away from the ground, interrupting the transfer of heat for a moment, while at night, when the body settles into rest, that interruption becomes less frequent, and the contact becomes more continuous, and in that continuity the process of heat loss becomes more complete, not in a sudden way, but in a steady progression that unfolds over the duration of the night. And this progression matters because it brings the body closer to the limits of what it can maintain without active heat production, and the feet, being both exposed and distant from the core, often reflect that limit earlier than other parts, becoming cooler even while the rest of the body remains within a more stable range. And this difference does not necessarily wake the body or prevent rest entirely, but it introduces a quiet instability, a condition in which the body must keep adjusting, even during periods that are meant for stillness. And those adjustments may be small, subtle changes in position, shifts in contact, movements that reduce the intensity of the exchange without removing it. And over time, these small responses form part of the nightly rhythm, a pattern of partial rest shaped by the ongoing interaction between body and ground. And if we think again about the earlier human environments, where the body first developed in African landscapes before later populations moved into colder regions, we can see that this pattern would already have been present, because the ground at night does not need to be extremely cold to begin taking heat. It only needs to be cooler than the body, and to remain in contact long enough for that difference to matter. And as humans later encountered environments where nighttime cooling was stronger or lasted longer, the same process would have continued, only with a greater difference between body and surface, making the effects more noticeable but not fundamentally different. And this continuity helps explain why the problem of keeping the feet warm was not tied to a single extreme condition, but to a repeated structure of daily life, where night brought stillness, stillness extended contact, and extended contact allowed heat to leave more completely, and within that structure the feet remained a consistent point of exposure, a place where the body's ability to generate warmth could not fully match the duration of its contact with a cooler world. And perhaps this is where the deeper meaning of the title begins to settle, because early humans did not fail to keep their feet warm in isolated moments. They lived within a cycle that made such warmth difficult to sustain over time, especially when the body could no longer rely on movement to support it, and when the earth beneath them, unchanged by their need for rest, continued to receive warmth throughout the long hours of the night, leaving the feet as one of the clearest signs of a body that could endure, adjust, and survive, but could not fully escape the quiet cost of being in contact with the ground for as long as darkness lasted. Even when early humans found some form of shelter, that did not necessarily mean they had escaped the thermal influence of the ground, because shelter can change many things above the body without changing what lies beneath it. And this distinction matters for the feet, since a roof may reduce wind, a wall may soften exposure, and a protected space may make the air feel calmer. Yet none of these things automatically creates a warm surface under the body, and for much of early human history the most difficult part of keeping the feet warm may have remained exactly where it had always been, at the point of contact with the earth itself, because the earliest shelters were not enclosed houses with insulated floors, but places that reduced some environmental pressures while leaving others largely in place. And this means that even when humans began to use caves, rock overhangs, simple windbreaks, or temporary built structures, the ground inside those places could still remain cooler than the body, still capable of receiving heat through contact, and still able to expose the same quiet limitation that open landscapes had already revealed, which is that the feet do not stop losing warmth simply because the air around them becomes less harsh. And this is important because it keeps the story from becoming too simple, since shelter is often imagined as a complete answer to cold, when in reality it may only solve one part of the problem, especially in earlier conditions where the body remained close to natural surfaces, and where any materials placed between skin and earth were likely to be uneven, partial, temporary, or dependent on what was available nearby. And if we think back to the deeper beginning of the human story, to bodies first shaped in African environments where upright walking became central before later humans expanded into colder and more seasonal regions, we can see that shelter itself would have emerged gradually, in forms that helped humans manage exposure but did not instantly separate them from the thermal reality of the ground. And that means the basic condition of foot-to-earth contact remained present even as human behavior became more flexible and inventive, because using a place of refuge is not the same as transforming that place into a consistently warm interior. And in caves especially, there is a quiet irony, since they can shield the body from wind and weather while still surrounding it with stone and earth that hold coolness well, often more steadily than the open air above, and in such settings the feet may have remained vulnerable in a different way, not through wind-driven cold, but through prolonged contact with dense surfaces that continue to draw heat away with very little interruption. And even in more open shelters made from branches, hides, or other local materials, the same issue likely remained unless enough soft, dry matter could be gathered and maintained beneath the body, which would not always have been easy. And even then, such material would have reduced rather than eliminated heat loss, because it is difficult to fully remove the influence of the ground without a more permanent barrier. And early humans, for long stretches of time, did not live with such permanent barriers underfoot, and so shelter changed the experience of cold without erasing it, taking away some pressures while leaving the feet in contact with a surface that still held less warmth than the body. And this helps explain why the title remains so focused on the feet rather than the whole body, because the foot is where partial protection becomes most visible, where the difference between safer air and cooler ground can still be felt as a quiet imbalance, and where the limits of shelter reveal themselves most clearly, not in dramatic failure, but in the simple fact that one can be protected overhead and still continue losing warmth below. And perhaps that is one of the most revealing things about early human life. That adaptation often worked by reducing hardship rather than removing it, by creating better conditions without creating perfect ones. And the earliest shelters seem to fit that pattern well, offering relief, cover, and advantage while still leaving the body's lowest edge exposed to the same old exchange. The steady passing of warmth into the earth that supported human survival, while quietly taking something from it in return. Even within these early forms of shelter, the question of what lay beneath the body remained difficult to resolve, because creating a space overhead is not the same as changing the surface underfoot. And for early humans, the materials available to soften or separate that contact were often limited, inconsistent, and dependent on what could be gathered nearby, such as grasses, leaves, branches, hides, or other natural matter. And while these materials could provide some degree of separation, they did not always form a stable or lasting layer, and their effectiveness could change quickly depending on how they were arranged, how dry they remained, and how long they could be kept in place. And this matters because insulation at the ground level is not only about having something between the body and the earth, but about how well that material can resist the steady movement of heat. And loose natural materials, especially when compressed under body weight, can lose much of their insulating ability over time, allowing heat to pass through more easily than might be expected. And moisture adds another quiet complication, because when grasses or leaves become damp, whether from the environment or from repeated use, they can begin to conduct heat more effectively, reducing their ability to protect the body from the cooler ground beneath. And this means that even when early humans made efforts to create a softer or more separated resting surface, the result was often partial, changing from one moment to the next, never fully stable, and never completely blocking the exchange of heat that had always existed between foot and earth. And this partial nature of ground insulation helps explain why the feet remained exposed even in places that might otherwise seem protective, because the body could be sheltered from wind and rain while still gradually losing warmth through the surfaces it depended on for support. And if we think again about the earlier phases of human life, where the body first took shape in African environments before expanding into colder and more seasonal regions, we can see that this challenge would have been present from the beginning, because the ground was always part of the environment that had to be managed, not something that could be easily transformed. And as human groups later moved into areas where the difference between body and ground temperature could become more pronounced, the same limitations in available materials and techniques would have made it difficult to create a consistent barrier beneath the feet. And this continuity is important because it shows that the problem was not simply a matter of knowledge or effort, but of what was physically possible within the conditions and resources available at the time. And even as human behavior became more flexible and inventive, the ground remained a surface that could not be fully controlled, only moderated. And moderation is not the same as elimination, because it reduces the effect without removing it. And so the feet, as the point of contact, continued to reflect that unfinished condition, remaining sensitive to the temperature and structure of whatever lay beneath them, and continuing to lose warmth slowly even when some form of separation was present. And this gives the story a quieter but more realistic shape, where early humans did not ignore the problem of cold feet, but worked within limits that allowed improvement without complete resolution, and within those limits the body continued to function, to rest, and to move, while still carrying the same basic relationship with the ground, one in which contact remained necessary and warmth remained something that could not be fully held at the lowest edge of the body. Over time, this means that early shelter should not be imagined as a clean boundary between safety and exposure, but as a softer and more incomplete adjustment, one that changed the conditions of life without fully transforming them. And this is especially clear at the level of the feet, because the feet reveal what shelter could not easily solve: the continued need for the body to rest, stand, and move on surfaces that remained thermally separate from the body's own warmth. And even when humans chose caves, overhangs, protected hollows, or built temporary coverings from local materials, the earth beneath them still belonged to the same wider environment, still holding the temperatures of stone, soil, shade, moisture, and night, and still able to receive heat whenever skin or lightly covered flesh met it for long enough. And this creates a quiet but important lesson, that shelter changed exposure from above more easily than exposure from below, because wind can be blocked, rain can be reduced, darkness can be met with fire when available, but the ground remains under every human body, and whatever is placed on top of it remains subject to compression, dampness, decay, and disturbance, which means the barrier beneath the feet is often the least stable part of the whole arrangement. And for early humans, this would have mattered most not in dramatic moments, but in the ordinary duration of daily and nightly life, where small weaknesses repeated many times become more important than rare extremes. And if the body spends long periods close to the ground, then even partial heat loss becomes meaningful over time, especially at the feet, which are already distant from the warm center of the body and already shaped more for movement and sensitivity than for insulation. And when those feet remain in shelters that soften the air but do not fully warm the surface below, the same old exchange continues, only now in quieter surroundings. And perhaps that quietness is what makes the problem easier to miss, because an enclosed place can feel safe, calm, and protected while still allowing warmth to leave through the lowest points of contact. And this may have been one of the most ordinary truths of early human life, that improvement did not arrive all at once, and that even useful innovations often left older limits in place. And if we return again to the beginning of the human story, to bodies first shaped for upright movement in African environments before later populations expanded into colder and more seasonal lands, we can see how this pattern fits the larger logic of human adaptation, because the body itself did not become a sealed system separated from the ground, and early shelters did not fully create that separation either. Instead, both body and shelter worked together as partial responses, enough to support survival, enough to reduce exposure, enough to make rest more possible, but not enough to turn the feet into naturally warm structures in contact with cool surfaces. And this is why the title continues to hold its force even here, because early humans could enter shelter and still not keep their feet warm, not because shelter was useless, but because its protection was uneven, strongest above, weakest below, and the feet remained at the meeting point where the body's need for support could not be separated from the earth's quiet ability to take heat away. And in caves this might happen through stone that stayed cool longer than the outside air, in simple windbreaks through ground that lost its warmth after sunset, and in temporary camps through gathered materials that flattened, shifted, or absorbed moisture, all leaving the feet within reach of the same thermal reality they faced outside, though perhaps in a calmer and less visible form. And this gives the story a kind of patience, because it shows that early humans did not fail to invent shelter. They simply lived in a world where shelter could not yet solve every problem equally, and the ground remained one of the hardest problems to change. And so the feet continued to mark the unfinished edge of protection, the place where the body could be partly defended and yet still open, partly sheltered and yet still cooling, resting under cover while giving warmth, slowly and steadily, into the earth below. When the feet remain cool for long enough, the effect does not have to become dramatic in order to matter, because the body does not only depend on rest as a total state of sleep or stillness, it depends on how steady that rest can remain, how long the body can settle without being quietly pulled back toward adjustment. And this is where cold feet may have had a deeper influence than they first seemed to, not as a single cause of lost sleep or failed recovery, but as one of the small, repeated pressures that could make full stillness harder to maintain over time, especially in early human life, where resting often meant remaining close to the ground with few reliable barriers between the body and the cooler surface beneath it. And if the feet were already one of the easiest places for warmth to leave, then the periods when the body most needed stability may also have been the periods when that loss became hardest to ignore, because rest removes the help of movement, lowers active heat production, and extends contact with the same surface that continues receiving warmth without interruption. And this creates a quiet mismatch between what the body needs and what the environment allows, since the body may be trying to settle, conserve energy, and recover from the demands of the day, while the feet remain involved in an unfinished exchange with the ground, slowly cooling, slowly shifting the balance of comfort, and perhaps encouraging slight movements, posture changes, or periods of shallow disturbance that do not fully end rest but prevent it from becoming as stable as it might otherwise be. And this idea needs to be handled carefully, because the archaeological record cannot tell us directly how any one early human slept on any one night, nor can we claim with certainty exactly how cold feet affected the length or depth of rest across prehistory, but we can say more modestly that the physical conditions were present for such an effect to matter, since the feet are sensitive, exposed, distant from the warm center of the body, and often in prolonged contact with cooler ground during the very hours when movement has stopped. And that combination makes them a plausible source of repeated low-level discomfort rather than a dramatic crisis. And low-level discomfort, when repeated often enough, can shape how rest is experienced, even if it leaves only subtle traces. And if we return again to the earliest human beginnings in African landscapes, before later populations moved into colder and more seasonal regions, the point still holds, because the issue is not only severe cold, but the persistent fact that after sunset the ground often cools below body temperature and remains there, and once the feet rest against that surface for long durations, warmth begins to leave in a way that the body can manage but not fully reverse without movement or external insulation. And as humans later entered regions with stronger nighttime cooling, longer winters, or denser ground surfaces such as stone and packed earth, the same basic relationship would have continued, only with greater intensity, and that suggests a continuity in which the feet remained one of the body's least stable points during rest, a small but meaningful weakness at the edge of recovery. And this matters because recovery in early human life was not a luxury, but part of survival itself, a time when energy needed to be restored, muscles relaxed, and the body given enough stillness to continue again, and any condition that repeatedly made stillness less complete, even slightly, would have carried weight over the long run, not as a single dramatic burden, but as one more quiet limit built into ordinary life. And perhaps that is the deeper value of asking this question, because it reveals that early human hardship was not only made of hunger, danger, or weather in their largest forms, but also of small unfinished frictions between body and world, conditions that did not stop life but shaped its texture. And cold feet seemed to belong to that texture, not a total barrier to rest, but a persistent interference at the lowest edge of the body, where warmth could keep slipping into the ground even while the rest of the person tried to become still enough to recover. When rest becomes less stable, the body does not always respond in obvious ways, because not every disturbance rises to the level of waking, and not every discomfort becomes a clear event that could be remembered or described. Yet the body can still be drawn into small adjustments, slight shifts of posture, changes in contact, moments of tension followed by release. And these quiet interruptions matter because recovery depends not only on being still, but on remaining still, long enough for the body to settle into a more complete form of rest. And if the feet continue cooling while the rest of the body is trying to conserve warmth, they may become one of the places where that settling remains incomplete, not broken entirely, but made less steady. And this idea stays within careful limits, because we cannot claim exact sleep patterns for early humans, and we cannot measure directly how often cool feet change the quality of their rest across different times and places. But we can say that the conditions for repeated interference were present, since prolonged contact with cooler ground, reduced movement, and limited insulation at the feet create a situation in which the body may need to respond again and again, even if only in small and nearly silent ways. And those responses would not necessarily prevent survival, because early humans were fully capable of enduring imperfect rest, just as they endured many other forms of incomplete comfort. But endurance is not the same as ease, and a body that rests under minor thermal strain may still recover less smoothly than one that remains more evenly warm, especially at the edges where circulation is already more difficult to maintain. And this becomes more meaningful when we remember that rest in early human life was not simply a pause between modern routines, but part of a larger rhythm of survival in which the body needed to recover enough to continue moving, gathering, carrying, watching, and adapting the next day. And if the feet remained one of the body's quiet trouble points during the hours of darkness, then the influence of that problem may have extended beyond sensation into the texture of rest itself, making it shallower, more interrupted, or more dependent on subtle movement than it would otherwise have been. And these possibilities become especially plausible when we think about the surfaces involved, because stone, packed earth, damp ground, or thin layers of gathered plant material do not create a deeply stable thermal environment, and when body weight rests on them for long enough, even dry materials may compress, reducing their capacity to slow heat loss, while moisture makes the process more efficient still, and that means the feet could remain in a gradual but persistent exchange with the ground through much of the night, even in sheltered spaces. And if we carry this thought back toward the earlier origins of the human body in African landscapes, before later movement into colder and more seasonal regions, the same structure remains visible, because the problem does not require snow or extreme winter to matter. It only requires prolonged contact with ground that stays cooler than the body during the hours of stillness. And as humans later entered places where nighttime conditions became harsher, this ordinary challenge would likely have become sharper, though not fundamentally different, and that continuity keeps the question grounded in something broader than climate alone, which is the basic structure of a body trying to rest while one part of it remains exposed to steady thermal loss. And perhaps this helps explain why cold feet belong so naturally in the story of early human life, not as a dramatic symbol of suffering, but as one of the many small unfinished pressures that shaped daily existence from below, quietly influencing how fully the body could settle, how often it had to adjust, and how recovery may have remained something achieved through endurance rather than through complete physical ease. And in that sense, the feet become more than a detail, because they mark the place where the need for rest met the limits of the environment most directly, where the body could lie down, close its eyes, and still remain partly engaged in the simple work of managing warmth that continued to leave through contact with the earth. Over many nights and across many lives, these small adjustments may have accumulated into something larger than any single moment could reveal, not as a clear disruption that could be measured or named, but as a gradual shaping of how rest fit into the rhythm of early human existence. Because when the body must repeatedly manage a condition that it cannot fully resolve, it does not simply ignore it, it adapts around it, finding ways to continue while carrying the cost quietly. And for the feet, that cost was the steady loss of warmth during the very hours when the body needed stillness the most. And while this loss did not prevent rest altogether, it may have influenced how deep, how continuous, or how stable that rest could become, especially in environments where the ground remained cooler through long portions of the night. And if we think about this not as a single night, but as a repeated pattern across generations, the importance becomes less about any one experience and more about the conditions that shaped many experiences over time, since early humans lived within environments where the body's relationship with the ground was constant, and where the feet remained one of the most exposed parts of that relationship, and this exposure, even when mild, would have been present often enough to become part of the background of rest itself. a quiet factor that did not define survival but contributed to its texture. And it is important to remain careful here, because the evidence does not allow us to draw precise conclusions about how rest differed in measurable terms, and we cannot assign exact effects or outcomes to the cooling of the feet in prehistory, but we can observe that the physical conditions existed for such an influence to matter, and that influence would likely have been subtle, distributed across time rather than concentrated in single events, and expressed through the body's ongoing need to adjust, reposition, and manage discomfort in ways that do not always leave clear traces. And when we return again to the earlier human origins in African landscapes, before later expansion into colder regions, we see that this pattern did not begin with extreme climates, but with the simple fact that nighttime ground often falls below body temperature and remains in contact with the feet for extended periods, and as human groups later encountered environments where this difference became more pronounced, the same underlying relationship would have continued, only with greater intensity, reinforcing a condition that had already existed for a long time. And this continuity helps explain why the problem of keeping the feet warm was never fully solved at the level of the body itself. Because it did not need to be eliminated for survival to continue, it only needed to be managed well enough for the body to function, to recover sufficiently, and to rise again the next day. And perhaps that is the most revealing point in this part of the story, that early human life did not wait for perfect conditions in order to go on. It moved forward within limits, adapting around them, enduring them, and sometimes improving them through behavior and environment, but not always removing them completely. And the feet, in their quiet exposure to the ground, seem to mark one of those enduring limits, a place where warmth could not be fully held, even during rest, and where the body, though capable and resilient, remained partly open to the steady influence of the world beneath it, carrying that influence into the rhythm of night, into the process of recovery, and into the long continuity of human life that unfolded step by step, pause by pause, and night after night without ever fully closing the gap between body warmth and the cooler earth below. The human body does not protect every part of itself equally, and one of the clearest places where this uneven protection can be felt is at the feet, because when conditions begin to cool, the body's first concern is not to preserve warmth everywhere, but to preserve it where it matters most for immediate survival, around the organs, deep in the central spaces where the heart, lungs, and other vital systems must continue working within a narrow range. And this priority changes the meaning of cold at the edges of the body, since the hands and feet can become cooler not because they are unimportant, but because they are more expendable than the center, more able to tolerate variation without causing the whole system to fail. And this matters deeply for the question of early humans and their feet, because it means the difficulty of keeping the feet warm was not only caused by the coldness of the ground below, but also by the way the body itself responds when warmth becomes limited, narrowing its protection inward and allowing the outer parts to lose more than they otherwise would. And this process does not require extreme weather to begin, because even in modest cooling the body can begin to favor the core over the periphery, subtly reducing the warmth that reaches the feet while maintaining what is needed for more central tissues. And once the feet are in direct contact with cooler ground, that reduced protection becomes even more significant, because the warmth arriving from within may already be less than before, while the loss outward continues steadily through contact, and together these forces create a quiet asymmetry, the body holding tight at its center while loosening its grip at its edges. And in early human life this asymmetry would have been part of ordinary experience, not a rare emergency, because the body had to meet changing temperatures repeatedly, often without complete shelter, without stable flooring, and without reliable insulation at the feet. And if we return again to the earlier human beginnings in African landscapes, before later populations spread into colder and more seasonal regions, this pattern still makes sense, because the issue is not only severe cold, but the simple need of the body to manage warmth economically, keeping the center stable while allowing the margins to fluctuate, and the feet, far from the core and constantly involved in contact with the earth, were among the first places where that strategy could be felt, not as a dramatic shutdown, but as a gradual cooling that the body tolerated because it had to protect something more important than comfort. And this helps explain why the feet could remain functional while still becoming cold, because function and warmth are not the same threshold. And the body does not need the feet to stay warm in order for them to continue carrying weight, sensing the ground, and supporting movement. It only needs them to remain usable. And that difference reveals something essential about human survival, which is that the body often preserves the minimum needed for continuation rather than the full ease of every part. And in later human expansions into harsher climates, this same basic logic would have remained, only becoming more visible as the difference between body temperature and surrounding surfaces grew larger, making the sacrifice of warmth at the feet more pronounced without changing the underlying rule. And that rule is simple but powerful, that the body protects its center before its edges, and the feet live at the edge of that decision, receiving enough to endure but not always enough to stay warm. And perhaps this is why the title carries more than a narrow physical question, because early humans could not keep their feet warm partly for the same reason they stayed alive at all. The body was built to save the core first, even when that meant allowing the outermost parts to live with the quiet cost of growing cold. This inward priority becomes even more visible when the body is asked to manage limited warmth over time, because once heat is no longer abundant, every part cannot be maintained equally, and the body responds not with perfect fairness, but with selection, preserving what it must preserve and allowing greater fluctuation where it can afford to do so. And the feet stand near the far end of that choice, distant from the organs, heavily exposed, and in direct contact with surfaces that are often cooler than living tissue, which means they are placed at a double disadvantage, receiving less protected warmth from within while continuing to lose heat outward through touch. And this helps explain why the feet can cool even when the rest of the body still feels relatively stable, because the body is not failing in that moment. It is carrying out one of its oldest protective strategies, holding tighter at the center and loosening at the margins, and that strategy makes biological sense. Yet it also reveals why keeping the feet warm was always difficult for early humans, since the body itself was never fully committed to equal warmth everywhere, especially not in the parts farthest from the core. And once this is understood, the question changes slightly, because the problem is no longer only that the ground was cold, but that the body had already decided, in a quiet physiological way, where warmth mattered most, and the feet were not at the top of that list. And this would have shaped ordinary experience in early human life again and again, because people moved through landscapes where the thermal demands on the body changed with time of day, season, shade, moisture, altitude, and wind. And every time the body began to conserve warmth more carefully, the extremities would have reflected that shift sooner than the chest or abdomen, making the feet one of the first places where a cooler environment could be physically felt, even if the rest of the body still seemed able to continue without alarm. And that difference between core stability and peripheral cooling may have helped early humans survive many difficult conditions. But it also meant that warmth at the feet was always somewhat negotiable, always easier for the body to reduce than warmth at the center. And this may be why the feet could remain useful without remaining comfortable, because the threshold for survival is lower than the threshold for ease, and the body only needs enough warmth at the feet to preserve basic function, enough circulation to keep tissues working, enough sensation and movement to support travel and balance, but not necessarily enough to maintain the kind of stable warmth that would prevent all discomfort. And if we return once more to the earlier origins of the human body in African landscapes, before later populations spread into colder and more seasonal regions, this pattern still belongs there, because even in milder environments the body sometimes needs to conserve warmth, especially at night, in early morning, after rain, or in shaded places. And once it begins doing so, the same inward priority emerges, the same quiet shifting of resources toward the center and away from the edges. And as humans later moved into colder regions, this old pattern would have become sharper and more visible, not because the body changed its basic rule, but because the consequences of that rule became easier to feel when the world outside grew more demanding. And that continuity matters, because it keeps the story honest, showing that the feet did not become cold only in dramatic climates, but because they occupied a permanent position in the body's thermal hierarchy, one that made them more vulnerable whenever warmth had to be rationed. And in that sense, the feet reveal something important about the human condition itself, that survival often depends on unequal care within the body, on preserving the center at the expense of the margins. And this is not a mistake, but a design of priorities, one that made life possible while also leaving certain parts exposed to repeated discomfort, And perhaps that is why the question of cold feet reaches beyond the feet alone, because it shows that early humans did not simply face a cold world outside them, they also carried within them a system that could not and would not keep every edge equally warm, a system that defended life by narrowing warmth inward, leaving the lowest and farthest points of contact to endure more loss than the rest. And in that quiet decision, repeated across countless nights, pauses, and journeys, the feet became one of the clearest places where the body's wisdom and its limits could be felt at the same time. When this inward priority is allowed to unfold over time, it becomes less a single response to cold and more a constant background strategy, shaping how the body lives within its environment rather than reacting only to extreme conditions. And for the feet, this means that cooling is not always a sign of failure or danger, but often a sign of how the body is choosing to remain stable overall, preserving its most vital functions while allowing the outermost parts to adjust. And this adjustment is not uniform or immediate. It develops gradually, influenced by the surrounding temperature, the level of activity, the condition of the ground, and the length of contact. And in early human life, where these factors changed frequently, the feet would have reflected those changes again and again, becoming slightly cooler as the body conserved warmth, slightly warmer as movement increased, and never fully separated from the ongoing exchange with the ground beneath. And this continuous fluctuation is important because it shows that the difficulty of keeping the feet warm was not a fixed state, but a shifting condition, one that moved with the body's priorities and the environment's demands. And in that movement there is a quiet balance. Because the body does not abandon the feet entirely, it maintains enough warmth to keep them functional, enough circulation to support movement and sensation, enough stability to allow continued travel and rest, but it does not maintain them at the same level as the core, and this difference becomes especially visible during longer periods of stillness, when internal heat production is reduced, and the body must rely more heavily on its stored warmth, and in those moments the inward focus becomes stronger, drawing warmth toward the center and leaving the extremities to adjust as they can. And once again, the feet, being both distant and exposed, become one of the first places where this adjustment can be felt, not as a sudden loss, but as a gradual cooling that the body tolerates because it serves a larger purpose. And if we return to the earlier human origins in African landscapes, before later populations expanded into colder and more seasonal regions, this pattern still holds, because even there the body needed to manage its warmth carefully across changing conditions, and once that management began, the same priorities would have applied, protecting the center while allowing the edges to vary. And as humans moved into environments where the difference between body and ground became more pronounced, the same strategy would have continued, only with greater consequences for the feet, making their cooling more noticeable while leaving the underlying rule unchanged. And this continuity helps explain why the problem of keeping the feet warm persisted across such a long span of human history, because it was not only imposed from the outside by the environment, but supported from within by the body's own way of organizing its resources. And when those two forces meet, external cooling and internal prioritization, they reinforce each other, creating a condition that is difficult to fully overcome without changing either the body or the environment in a more fundamental way. And early humans, for much of their history, did not have the means to make that kind of complete change, and so they lived within the balance that existed, moving, resting, adapting, and enduring while their feet remained at the intersection of two steady influences, the ground that received heat and the body that reserved it for more central needs. And perhaps this is where the title finds one of its clearest answers, because early humans could not keep their feet warm not only because the world beneath them was cooler, but because the body itself was designed to accept that outcome when necessary, choosing survival at the center over comfort at the edge, and allowing the feet to remain one of the places where that choice could be quietly felt. For a long time, the human foot remained what it had always been, a structure shaped for movement and contact rather than for insulation, and this did not change quickly even as human behavior became more inventive, because the materials and techniques needed to create a consistent barrier between the foot and the ground did not appear all at once, and when they did begin to appear they were uneven, limited, and often tied to specific places, seasons, or ways of life, rather than forming a universal solution. And this means that the earliest forms of foot covering, when they existed, were likely to be temporary, adapted to local conditions, and dependent on what could be gathered, prepared, and maintained, such as animal hides, plant fibers, or other available materials. And even these early coverings would not necessarily have provided complete or lasting insulation, because they could wear down, shift with movement, absorb moisture, or fail to create a stable layer thick enough to prevent the steady transfer of heat into the ground. And this is important because it shows that the introduction of coverings did not immediately solve the problem of cold feet, but instead began a gradual process of improvement, one that worked alongside the body's existing limitations rather than replacing them entirely. And if we think again about the earlier human beginnings in African landscapes, where the body first took shape long before consistent footwear became widespread, we can see that the foot carried forward its original design into later environments. And when those environments demanded more protection, the solutions available were not always sufficient to match the new conditions, especially in colder or more variable climates, where the difference between body and ground temperature could become more pronounced. And as human groups spread into such regions, they likely developed ways of covering the feet that were better suited to those environments. Yet even then, those coverings would have depended on materials that required preparation, maintenance, and replacement, and would not always have been present in every moment of daily life, meaning that direct contact with the ground remained part of the experience, even when some protection was available. And this continuity helps explain why the problem of keeping the feet warm persisted despite human ingenuity, because the body itself had not changed at its core, and the solutions being developed were still constrained by what was possible within the environment, and by the need to balance protection with movement, since a covering that insulated well but restricted flexibility, grip, or awareness of the ground could introduce new difficulties, even as it reduced heat loss. And this creates another form of compromise, one that mirrors the earlier compromise in the structure of the foot itself, where no single solution fully satisfied all demands at once, and instead, early humans likely worked within a range of partial answers, sometimes covering the feet, sometimes leaving them exposed, sometimes adjusting based on terrain, season, or activity, and always remaining connected to the ground in ways that could not be fully avoided. And over time, these partial solutions may have improved the situation, making it easier to retain warmth under certain conditions, but they did not erase the underlying relationship between the body and the earth, and so the feet remained a place where that relationship could still be felt, especially when coverings were absent, worn, or insufficient for the conditions. And perhaps this is what gives this part of the story its quiet importance, because it shows that even as humans began to change their environment and create tools to support their survival, some problems did not disappear. They simply became less severe, less constant, or more manageable. And the question of cold feet seems to belong to that category, a problem that was gradually reduced but never fully removed for a long stretch of human history, and one that continued to reveal the limits of both the body and the materials available to protect it, reminding us that adaptation often moves step by step, improving conditions without fully closing the gap between what the body needs and what the world provides. Even when coverings for the feet became possible, they did not instantly become universal, reliable, or equal in quality across all human groups. And this matters because it is easy to imagine footwear as a clear turning point, a moment when the old problem of cold feet simply faded away, when in reality the change was likely much slower, more uneven, and more dependent on local conditions than that, since any foot covering had to be made from available materials, shaped by hand, maintained through repeated use, and replaced when it wore out, and each of those steps required time, skill, and circumstances that may not always have been present, especially for people living in highly mobile ways, moving through environments where resources had to serve many needs at once, and even when animal hides, plant fibers, or other simple materials were used to protect the feet, the resulting coverings would have varied greatly in thickness, dryness, fit, and durability. And those differences matter, because a covering that is loose, thin, wet, or worn does not create the same barrier as one that is dry, stable, and well layered, meaning that the thermal benefit of early footwear was unlikely to be constant, and may have changed from day to day, or even within the same day as conditions shifted. And moisture again becomes important here, because a material that may help hold warmth while dry can become far less effective once damp, whether from ground contact, rain, snow, or the simple accumulation of use. And once that happens, the foot remains covered in one sense but not fully protected in another, still vulnerable to the steady loss of heat through contact with colder ground. And this shows that the arrival of foot coverings did not end the old relationship between foot and earth, but only altered it, sometimes reducing the directness of contact, sometimes softening its effect, but not always eliminating the thermal cost beneath it. And if we return once more to the long beginning of the human story, to bodies first shaped in African landscapes long before consistent footwear, we can see why this later shift would remain incomplete for so long, because the body itself had already developed around bare or near-bare contact with the ground, and the skills, materials, and habits needed to create dependable barriers at the foot emerged only gradually as humans entered more varied and more demanding environments. And even then, those barriers were not guaranteed in all places, all seasons, or all situations, and this likely created a world in which some moments of life were better protected than others, some journeys more insulated than others, and some resting places still close enough to the ground for the old problem to return, especially when coverings were removed, damaged, or unsuited to the terrain. And this unevenness helps explain why the difficulty of keeping the feet warm persisted for so long, despite human ingenuity, because invention does not spread evenly, and a useful tool does not become a constant part of life the moment it first appears. And perhaps just as importantly, foot coverings always had to preserve more than warmth alone, since humans still needed to walk efficiently, feel enough of the ground to remain stable, and move across changing surfaces without too much restriction. And that means early footwear, like the foot itself, was likely shaped by compromise, balancing protection against mobility rather than solving one problem at any cost. And in that compromise there is a quiet continuity with everything that came before, because the human story is often one of partial answers, of better conditions rather than perfect ones. And cold feet seem to remain within that pattern, gradually moderated but not instantly erased, less exposed in some settings and still vulnerable in others. And this gives the title another layer of meaning, because early humans could not keep their feet warm not simply because they lacked coverings, but because the coverings they gradually developed were themselves limited, variable, and slow to become dependable enough to separate the body fully from the cooler world beneath it. As these early coverings became part of human life, they did not replace the old relationship between foot and ground so much as layer over it, adding a degree of separation without fully removing the contact that had always defined movement. And this layered condition is important because it shows that even as humans began to change their environment in more deliberate ways, the results remained partial for a long time, shaped by what could be made, carried, and maintained within daily life. And for the feet, this meant that protection was often present in degrees rather than as a constant state, sometimes thicker, sometimes thinner, sometimes dry and effective, sometimes damp and less reliable, and at times absent altogether, depending on circumstance. And this unevenness kept the old problem alive beneath the new solution, because whenever the barrier weakened, shifted, or disappeared, the same steady exchange of heat could return, and even when the barrier remained in place, it might only slow the process rather than stop it, allowing warmth to last longer, but still letting it pass gradually into the ground below. And this is why the introduction of coverings did not immediately transform the experience of the feet into one of stable warmth, but instead created a new balance, one in which the body relied partly on external materials and partly on the same internal strategies it had always used, such as movement, posture, and the prioritization of heat toward the core. And in that combined system, the feet were still influenced by the same underlying conditions, only moderated to varying degrees by whatever protection was available at the time. And if we return again to the earliest human origins in African landscapes, before later populations spread into colder and more seasonal regions, we can see that this layered approach fits the broader pattern of human adaptation, because the body itself did not change suddenly when coverings appeared, and the coverings themselves did not instantly become perfect, and so the two worked together imperfectly, each compensating for the other's limits without eliminating them. And as human groups moved into regions where the need for insulation at the feet became more pressing, this system would have been tested more strongly, leading to improvements over time. But even then, those improvements would have depended on materials that could wear out, on skills that needed to be maintained, and on environmental conditions that could still interfere with effectiveness, such as moisture, terrain, and repeated use. And this continuity helps explain why the difficulty of keeping the feet warm remained part of human life for so long, because the solutions available were always situated within a larger set of constraints. And those constraints did not disappear simply because a new idea or tool had been introduced. And perhaps this is one of the most revealing aspects of the story, that human innovation does not erase every problem at once, but gradually reshapes the conditions under which those problems are experienced, and in doing so leaves traces of the old challenges within the new systems. And the feet carry those traces clearly, because they remain close to the ground, close to the source of heat loss, and close to the limits of both anatomy and technology in early human history. And even as coverings improved and spread, the feet continued to mark the place where the body met the earth most directly, where warmth could still slip away if the barrier failed or proved incomplete, and where the long continuity of human life, from bare contact to partial protection, could still be felt in the simplest act of standing, walking, or resting on the ground. And this gives the title a final depth in this stage of the story, because early humans could not keep their feet warm not only because they lacked solutions, but because the solutions themselves took time to become reliable, and even then remained shaped by the same compromises that had always defined the relationship between the human body and the world beneath it. By the time we reach this point in the story, the question no longer seems to belong only to the feet, because the feet have quietly led us towards something larger, which is the fact that early human life was shaped not by perfect solutions, but by tolerable limits, by conditions the body could endure without fully overcoming. And the feet are one of the clearest examples of this, because they remained useful, strong enough for movement, sensitive enough for balance, and adaptable enough for travel, while still never becoming naturally secure places of warmth. And this matters because it changes the meaning of adaptation itself. Since adaptation is often imagined as a process that solves the problems of an environment once and for all, when in reality, many human traits seem to have emerged through compromise, preserving what mattered most for survival while leaving other needs only partly answered. And the feet fit this pattern closely, shaped for locomotion, shaped for contact, shaped for endurance across uneven ground, but not shaped to resist the steady thermal cost of that same contact. And if we return once more to the older beginnings of the human body in African landscapes, before later populations expanded into colder, wetter, and more seasonal regions, we can see why this unfinished quality remained, because the foot first took its current general form within one set of demands, and then was carried into many others. And in those later environments, the same strengths remained valuable, but the same weakness became more noticeable, not because the body had failed, but because it had never been designed to meet every future condition equally well. And this is one reason the problem of warmth at the feet followed humans for so long, because it lay at the intersection of several forces that were all difficult to change at once. The cooler temperature of the ground, the body's inward priority toward the core, the need for constant contact during movement, the limits of early shelter, the instability of natural ground coverings, and the gradual imperfect development of footwear. And when all of those are placed together, the picture that emerges is not one of a missing solution, but of a body living within a set of negotiated boundaries, each one manageable, none one entirely removed. And perhaps that is why the title continues to feel so revealing, because it asks a small question and leads toward a broader truth, that early humans could cross landscapes, survive climatic change, and build new ways of living while still carrying forward certain unsolved edges in the body itself. And the feet remained one of those edges, not an accident, not an error, but a place where the demands of movement were chosen over the luxury of steady warmth. And if we think about rest again, about the night ground, the slow loss of heat, the subtle adjustments of posture, and the repeated need to continue despite incomplete comfort, then the feet begin to look less like a minor detail and more like a quiet record of what human survival often required, which was not perfect protection, but enough resilience to go on, enough flexibility to adapt, and enough tolerance for discomfort that life could continue before every condition had been mastered. And this does not make the story bleak, because there is something deeply human in that unfinished state, something honest, since it reminds us that much of human history was not built on complete control over the environment, but on the ability to live within its pressures while slowly, unevenly, and never perfectly reducing them, and the warmth of the feet seems to belong to that long pattern, a problem managed through movement, shelter, material, and habit, but never entirely solved at the level of the body alone. And so as we move toward the end, the question becomes quieter and perhaps deeper, because what the feet reveal is not only why they grew cold, but what kind of creature had to keep walking while they did, a creature whose success did not come from escaping every limit, but from enduring certain limits long enough to build a different world around them. As the story draws closer to its end, the question of warmth at the feet begins to feel less like a problem waiting for a solution, and more like a condition that shaped how early humans lived within their world, because over long stretches of time, the body does not always eliminate its limits. It learns to move with them, to adjust around them, and to build ways of life that remain possible even when certain discomforts persist. And this is especially clear in the case of the feet, where the steady loss of warmth did not stop movement, did not prevent survival, and did not halt the long expansion of human life into different environments, but instead became one of the many quiet factors that had to be managed day after day, night after night. And if we follow that idea carefully, we begin to see that the inability to keep the feet fully warm did not define early humans as weak, but as adaptable, because they continued to move, to rest, and to endure even while carrying a condition that could not be completely removed at the level of the body alone. And this suggests a different way of thinking about human history, one that does not look for perfect solutions at every stage, but recognizes that many parts of the body and many aspects of life remained unfinished for a very long time, not because they were ignored, but because the cost of changing them completely would have been too high in relation to other needs. And in the case of the feet, those needs included flexibility, sensitivity, balance, and the ability to travel across varied terrain, all of which were essential for survival in ways that stable warmth alone could not replace. And so the body preserved what allowed it to move and endure, even if that meant accepting a steady, low-level loss of heat at the point of contact with the ground. And as human behavior grew more complex, as shelters improved, as materials were used more skillfully, and as coverings for the feet became more common, the condition itself did not disappear all at once, but slowly changed in its intensity and frequency, becoming less constant in some contexts while remaining present in others. And this gradual shift reflects a broader pattern in human life, where change often accumulates over long periods, reshaping conditions step by step rather than replacing them entirely in a single moment. And if we look again at the earlier human origins in African landscapes, before later populations moved into colder and more seasonal regions, we can see how this pattern began, with a body already shaped for movement and already exposed to the quiet exchange of heat with the ground. And from that beginning, every later development worked within the same basic framework, modifying it, extending it, and sometimes softening its effects, but never completely removing the original relationship between foot and earth. And this continuity gives the story a kind of calm coherence, because it shows that early humans did not move from a state of total vulnerability to one of total control, but from one set of limits to another, gradually improving their position while still remaining part of the environment they inhabited. And perhaps this is where the meaning of the title settles most clearly, because early humans could not keep their feet warm not simply because they lacked knowledge or tools, but because the body they carried and the world they lived in were aligned in such a way that complete warmth at the edge was never the primary condition for survival. And so they lived, moved, and rested within that alignment, enduring its effects while slowly building new ways to soften them. And in doing so, they revealed something essential about human life, that it does not wait for perfect conditions to continue, but proceeds through imperfect ones, shaping them gradually while remaining, for a long time, in contact with the same ground that quietly received its warmth. And so the story comes back to the ground, to that simple meeting point where the human body gave its weight to the earth and, little by little, gave some of its warmth as well. Because in the end, the question was never only about cold feet, but about what kind of creature early humans were, and what kind of world they had to live within, a world that did not offer comfort first, and a body that did not solve every problem completely, yet still proved capable of carrying human life across immense stretches of time. And that may be the quiet lesson hidden inside this subject, that survival does not always belong to the body that is most protected in every way, but often to the body that can endure an unfinished condition without breaking, that can keep moving even when some part of it remains exposed, that can rest imperfectly and still rise again. And the feet seem to hold that lesson with unusual clarity, because they stayed close to the oldest truth of human life, that to live was to remain in contact with the world, not above it, not insulated from it, but pressed against it step after step, season after season, generation after generation, and through that contact the human body learned not how to escape every pressure, but how to continue within them, how to balance warmth and loss, motion and stillness, shelter and exposure, enough to survive, enough to adapt, enough to slowly change the conditions around itself without ever becoming fully separate from them. And there is something worth keeping from that history now, not as advice in a narrow sense, but as a way of seeing the body more honestly. Because the human body is not a perfect machine built for uninterrupted ease. It is a record of old compromises, old pathways, old priorities, and many of the small discomforts that still feel strangely familiar are not random at all, but echoes of the environments in which the body first learned to remain alive. And when we notice that, a little more patience becomes possible, a little more respect for the body becomes possible too, because its limits are not always signs of failure. Sometimes they are signs of a much older success, the success of lasting long enough, adapting far enough, and carrying life forward even without complete solutions. And this gives the story an educational meaning that goes beyond prehistory, because it reminds us that human history is not only the history of tools, shelters, and inventions, but also the history of living bodies negotiating with the world, losing something here, preserving something there, enduring small costs in order to protect larger possibilities. And the feet, humble and often ignored, were part of that negotiation from the beginning, supporting travel, carrying weight, sensing danger, adjusting to uneven ground, while never fully escaping the cold that came with such closeness to the earth. And perhaps that is why this question matters, because it turns a small discomfort into a larger understanding, showing that human life was built not on perfect adaptation, but on workable adaptation, not on a final victory over nature, but on a long and patient conversation with it, in which the body gave and received, endured and adjusted, and slowly made a place for itself without ever becoming entirely free of the ground beneath it. And if that is true, then the cold of early human feet was not merely a hardship, but part of a deeper story about what it meant to be human at all, a creature able to survive without being finished, able to move without being fully protected, able to remain alive inside a body that always carried some old exposure forward into the future. And when we think of those early people standing at dusk, walking over cooling earth, or trying to settle into the long stillness of night while warmth continued to slip quietly downward, perhaps the final question is no longer only why their feet could not stay warm, but how much of being human has always depended on learning to live gently, patiently, and intelligently with limits that were never fully meant to disappear.